She thought she was offering shelter to a lost stranger, but the man standing at her door was a billionaire hiding from a life of lies, searching for the one thing money could never buy, a love that saw the real him. The storm wasn't supposed to hit that hard. At least, that's what he kept telling himself as he pushed through the freezing rain, each drop slicing across his skin like tiny shards of glass. His hood was soaked, his shoes heavy with mud, and the wind stole his breath every time he tried to inhale. He looked less like a man and more like a shadow, stumbling through the dark, tired, defeated, and unsure of where he would end up if he kept walking. When he saw the warm porch light glowing ahead, it felt almost unreal. A small house stood at the edge of a quiet street, its windows lit from within, the curtains gently swaying from the draft of the storm. He hesitated at the gate, gripping the metal with trembling fingers. He wasn't the type to ask for help. Not anymore. But tonight, the world felt too heavy, and the cold had seeped too far into his bones for pride to matter. He climbed the steps slowly, afraid they might creak too loudly and give him away. Before he could knock, the door opened, softly, cautiously, and she appeared. Her presence was warm in a way the porch light could never compete with. She stood wrapped in a cream-colored cardigan, her hair loosely tied back, a few strands falling around her face. Even in the pale glow of the doorway, he could see the quiet concern in her eyes. Concern, but not fear. Her gaze swept over him gently, taking in the soaked clothes, the shaking hands, the exhaustion pulling at the corners of his mouth. She didn't ask who he was or what he wanted. Instead, in a voice soft enough that it melted through the storm's roar, she said, "You look freezing. Please come inside." He almost didn't move. He wasn't used to kindness anymore, not the type that asked for nothing in return. But the warmth in her tone tugged at something inside him, something fragile he'd buried long ago. He stepped forward, and the moment he crossed the threshold, a wave of heat washed over him. Her home was small, but it felt alive, filled with a gentle vanilla scent, faint music playing somewhere deep inside, and the subtle warmth of a life lived with care. When she handed him a towel, her fingers grazed his knuckles. The touch was light, soft, but grounding, like she was silently letting him know he wasn't alone. He looked up, and for a heartbeat their eyes held. Hers were steady, warm, cautious, but not cold. His were apologetic, grateful, and surprised by how deeply this simple moment affected him. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough and cracked. She offered a small, reassuring smile, the kind that reached her eyes before it reached her lips. "No one should be out in weather like this," she murmured, stepping closer, not out of obligation, but something quieter, more instinctive. And as the storm raged outside, he realized something strange. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. She led him down a short hallway, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor, each one echoing gently in the quiet warmth of the house. He followed at a slow pace, partly because he was exhausted, but mostly because he was still trying to understand why a stranger would open her door to someone who looked as worn down as he did. The air inside the hallway held a cozy mix of lavender and fresh laundry, simple scents but grounding ones. Scents that made him feel like he'd stepped into a memory rather than a stranger's home. "This room should be warm enough," she said softly as she pushed open a door near the end of the hall. The guest room was small but cared for. A neatly made bed with soft gray blankets sat against the wall, a lamp glowing softly on the nightstand. A stack of books rested on a dresser, their spines worn as if they'd been read more than once. Nothing about the room felt unused or cold. It felt lived in, maybe by guests past, maybe by lonely evenings when she needed company from the stories inside those books. She walked in first, smoothing her hand over the blanket as if making sure it was perfectly straight. He watched the gentle movement of her wrist, the quiet care in her actions. She didn't rush. She didn't treat him like a burden. Every small gesture carried warmth. "You can rest here tonight," she said, still adjusting the pillows, though they were already perfectly placed. "If you need anything, water, food, just knock on my door. I'm right down the hall." When she finally turned to him, he caught the faintest look in her eyes. Not pity, something closer to curiosity, maybe recognition. As if she saw past his soaked clothes and tired posture and sensed the turmoil he'd been carrying long before the storm began. He murmured a quiet, "Thank you, really." She moved toward him to hand over a folded blanket, and as she did, her shoulder brushed softly against his arm. It was barely a touch, just a whisper of warmth through fabric, but it was enough to make both of them pause for the briefest second. Her breath hitched, his eyes lowered, not wanting to make her uncomfortable, yet unable to ignore how grounding that small moment felt. She stepped back with a soft, composed exhale. "I'll let you get some rest," she said gently. Her voice held that same calm steadiness he'd heard at the door, but now there was a softness underneath it, a quiet empathy she didn't quite hide. He watched her walk out, her cardigan brushing lightly against the doorframe as she turned off the hallway light, leaving only the golden glow from the bedside lamp. When he finally sat on the bed, the blankets soft under his palms, he felt the weight of everything he had been running from settle in his chest. Yet for the first time in years, that weight didn't feel unbearable. The storm rumbled faintly outside, but inside this room, wrapped in her unexpected kindness, he felt something unfamiliar bloom slowly in the quiet. Safety, warmth, hope. And as he lay down, with the faint vanilla scent of her home lingering in the air, he realized he wasn't just resting in a stranger's house. He was resting somewhere he wished he could stay. She led him down a short hallway, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor, each one echoing gently in the quiet warmth of the house. He followed at a slow pace, partly because he was exhausted, but mostly because he was still trying to understand why a stranger would open her door to someone who looked as worn down as he did. The air inside the hallway held a cozy mix of lavender and fresh laundry, simple scents but grounding ones, scents that made him feel like he'd stepped into a memory rather than a stranger's home. "This room should be warm enough," she said softly as she pushed open a door near the end of the hall. The guest room was small but cared for. A neatly made bed with soft gray blankets sat against the wall, a lamp glowing softly on a nightstand. A stack of books rested on a dresser, their spines worn as if they'd been read more than once. Nothing about the room felt unused or cold. It felt lived in, maybe by guests past, maybe by lonely evenings when she needed company from the stories inside those books. She walked in first, smoothing her hand over the blanket, as if making sure it was perfectly straight. He watched the gentle movement of her wrist, the quiet care in her actions. She didn't rush. She didn't treat him like a burden. Every small gesture carried warmth. "You can rest here tonight," she said, still adjusting the pillows, though they were already perfectly placed. "If you need anything, water, food, just knock on my door. I'm right down the hall." When she finally turned to him, he caught the faintest look in her eyes. Not pity, something closer to curiosity, maybe recognition. As if she saw past his soaked clothes and tired posture and sensed the turmoil he'd been carrying long before the storm began. He murmured a quiet, "Thank you, really." She moved toward him to hand over a folded blanket, and as she did, her shoulder brushed softly against his arm. It was barely a touch, just a whisper of warmth through fabric, but it was enough to make both of them pause for the briefest second. Her breath hitched, his eyes lowered, not wanting to make her uncomfortable, yet unable to ignore how grounding that small moment felt. She stepped back with a soft, composed exhale. "I'll let you get some rest," she said gently. Her voice held that same calm steadiness he'd heard at the door, but now there was a softness underneath it, a quiet empathy she didn't quite hide. He watched her walk out, her cardigan brushing lightly against the doorframe as she turned off the hallway light, leaving only the golden glow from the bedside lamp. When he finally sat on the bed, the blankets soft under his palms, he felt the weight of everything he had been running from settle in his chest. Yet for the first time in years, that weight didn't feel unbearable. The storm rumbled faintly outside, but inside this room, wrapped in her unexpected kindness, he felt something unfamiliar bloom slowly in the quiet. Safety, warmth, hope. And as he lay down, with the faint vanilla scent of her home lingering in the air, he realized he wasn't just resting in a stranger's house. He was resting somewhere he wished he could stay. Morning arrived quietly, as if the house itself wanted to protect the calm that had settled overnight. Soft light filtered in through the thin curtains of the guest room, warming the space with pale gold. He blinked awake slowly, uncertain for a brief moment where he was. The scent of something warm, eggs, maybe toast, drifted down the hallway. And beneath it, the faint, comforting vanilla he remembered from last night. For the first time in years, he hadn't woken up with tension in his chest. He sat up, listening to the subtle sounds of her moving around in the kitchen. The gentle clinking of dishes. The muffled hum of a radio playing an old song. The soft shuffle of her feet as she moved from counter to stove. Each sound painted a picture of a life lived quietly, peacefully, and alone. He made his way to the kitchen, hesitating in the doorway when he saw her. She stood by the stove, cooking with a steady, practiced rhythm. She wore a simple morning sweater, sleeves pushed slightly up her arms. Her hair was loosely tied again, a few strands falling around her face in the same effortless, graceful way as last night. She didn't see him yet, too focused on gently stirring a pan. The morning sun outlined her figure in a warm glow, making the scene feel almost unreal. He cleared his throat softly. She turned, surprised at first, but her expression melted instantly into a gentle smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying that warm, soft timbre that made the whole kitchen feel safer. He nodded, unable to fully express the gratitude sitting in his chest. "It smells amazing." She laughed quietly, and the sound filled the room with something light and tender. "It's just breakfast. Nothing fancy. But I thought you might be hungry." He stepped closer, stopping beside her near the counter. The heat from the stove made the space between them warm, almost intimate. He offered, "Can I help with anything?" She shook her head with a small smile, but she didn't move away. She let him stand there beside her, close enough that her sleeve brushed lightly against his forearm each time she reached for something. The soft contact sent a quiet warmth through him, unexpected, grounding, human. As she plated the food, she glanced at him, not quickly, not shyly, but with a gentle curiosity that lingered a moment too long. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked. "I did," he said honestly. "Better than I have in a long time." There was a soft pause. Her eyes held something, empathy, maybe recognition of a loneliness she knew too well. They sat at her small kitchen table, facing each other across steaming coffee cups. His hands were wrapped around the mug, absorbing its warmth, but his attention kept drifting to her. The small ways she reacted to things. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she got thoughtful. The soft furrow of her eyebrows when she listened intently. When she asked him gentle questions, nothing invasive, just human curiosity, he answered more openly than he expected. And she listened with the kind of attention that made him feel seen, truly seen. Outside, the world was waking. But inside this kitchen, it felt like time had slowed just enough for two strangers to breathe in the same quiet moment. And he found himself wishing breakfast would last just a little longer. The rain had finally stopped by the time breakfast was over, leaving the world washed clean and quietly glistening. Sunlight slipped through the clouds in soft streaks, warming the damp earth outside. She stood by the window for a moment, watching droplets slide down the glass, before turning to him with a small, almost shy smile. "Would you like to see the garden?" she asked. Her tone was casual, but something in her eyes suggested the garden was more than just plants. It was a piece of her, something she rarely shared. He nodded. "I'd like that." They stepped outside, the air cool but gentle, infused with the scent of rain-soaked soil and blooming flowers. Her backyard wasn't large, but it had the kind of quiet charm that came from years of careful tending. Rose bushes, still dotted with raindrops, lined the fence. Lavender plants swayed lightly in the soft breeze. A narrow stone path wound its way between patches of herbs and wildflowers, leading to a small wooden bench under an old tree. She walked a little ahead of him, her hand brushing against the tops of the flowers as she passed, as if greeting them. He followed slowly, taking in the scene and her presence within it. Something about her fit the garden perfectly, calm, grounded, quietly beautiful. "This is where I come when I need to think," she said, kneeling beside a rose bush. She lifted a single bloom gently, careful not to disturb the petals. "Or when the house feels too empty." He crouched beside her, watching the way her fingers moved, soft, deliberate, filled with affection. "It's peaceful," he said. She nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Most people don't see it. They say it's small, plain, but it helps me breathe." Without thinking, she reached forward to trim a wilted petal. As she leaned slightly too far, her balance wavered. He reacted instinctively, placing his hand lightly on the small of her back to steady her. The touch was meant to be brief, supportive, nothing more. But the moment his palm settled against her, everything stilled. Her breath caught softly. The warmth of her body radiated through the fabric of her sweater, gentle yet unmistakable. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed herself to lean subtly into the touch, her shoulders relaxing as if she hadn't realized how tense they were. "Thank you," she murmured, voice almost too soft for the breeze to carry. He withdrew his hand slowly, carefully, not wanting to startle her, or himself. But the imprint of her warmth lingered on his palm. They walked further along the garden path, side by side now, their steps unconsciously falling into the same rhythm. She told him about her work, her years of doing everything alone, the quiet evenings when she buried herself in books just to avoid her own silence. And he shared pieces of his past, not the wealth, not the mansion or the business world, but the parts that still ached. The loneliness, the pressure, the feeling of living a life people envied but never understood. As they reached the bench, she sat first, brushing a few petals aside. He joined her, keeping a respectful distance, though both of them felt the soft pull of wanting to be just a little closer. The garden around them shimmered in the post-rain light, but the real warmth came from the quiet between them, the kind that didn't feel empty at all. For the first time in a long time, he felt something blooming inside him, and she felt something long dormant begin to stir again. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted into warm shades of gold and amber. The storm long gone, but its memory still lingering in the faint scent of wet earth. She had gone inside to make tea, leaving him alone for a moment in the garden. The soft rustle of leaves and distant chirping should have been calming, but instead, a familiar heaviness pressed down on him. He sat on the wooden porch steps, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. The house behind him felt too warm, too gentle, too honest for a man still carrying such a huge lie on his shoulders. He had arrived at her door, looking like a lost stranger, and she had accepted him without question. She saw him, not the billionaire with a polished reputation, not the man whose life had been shaped by headlines, expectations, and relentless public scrutiny. With her, he wasn't a name. He wasn't an empire. He was simply human. A part of him wanted to cling to that feeling forever. Another part feared he didn't deserve it. He exhaled shakily, rubbing his hands together as if the truth itself was something cold he could warm away. He had told lies before, not harmful ones, just the small, necessary deceptions that came with living a life always under watch. But this felt different. She wasn't supposed to matter. And yet she did. More than she should. More than he had expected after only 2 days. The porch door opened with a soft click. She stepped outside, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea, her cardigan wrapped around her like a gentle shield against the evening chill. When she saw him, her face softened instantly, not with pity, but with concern that seemed to come from someplace quiet and instinctive. "You disappeared on me," she said lightly, her voice warm but tinged with worry. "Everything okay?" He tried to answer, but the words snagged in his throat. She sat beside him without waiting for an explanation, close enough that their shoulders brushed. The soft contact grounded him, settling something restless inside his chest. She held out 1 mug. "Here, you look like you need this." When her fingers touched, her warmth seeped into him, slow, steady, real. He stared at the tea for a moment, then set it down beside him. He couldn't hide behind warmth and kindness anymore. Not when she was looking at him like that, like she saw something worth understanding. She tilted her head, studying him. "You look lost," she whispered. "Talk to me, if you want." He swallowed hard. I don't want to ruin this." "Ruin what?" she asked gently. He dragged a hand through his hair, voice cracking as he finally let the truth, not the whole truth, but the raw emotion, slip through. "This feeling," he said quietly. "This safety. I don't get that often, and I don't want to lose it. Were you? Not because of something I haven't said yet." Her expression softened even more. Without thinking, she placed a hand on his forearm, slow, careful, her thumb lightly brushing the fabric of his sleeve in a silent reassurance. Her touch wasn't forceful or demanding. It was simply present, steady, patient. "You won't lose me," she whispered. "Not for feeling human." He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the warmth of her touch, the gentle steadiness of her presence. But deep down, he knew the hardest part still lay ahead, because she thought she was comforting a wanderer with nothing to his name, not a man who had built an empire he could barely stand to live in. Night settled slowly over the small house, wrapping everything in a soft, dusky blue. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting warm circles of gold across the steps where they still sat. She hadn't moved her hand from his arm, and he hadn't tried to pull away. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was fragile, charged, trembling with something neither of them dared to name. But the truth was no longer something he could outrun. He shifted slightly, and her hand followed instinctively, as if refusing to break the connection. She noticed and flushed softly, but didn't pull back. Her thumb gave one small, reassuring stroke on his sleeve, a gesture so gentle it nearly broke him open. "I haven't been fully honest with you," he said finally. She didn't gasp or stiffen. She merely looked at him, steady, curious, and quietly bracing herself for whatever truth might come. Her presence was anchoring in a way he didn't deserve. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to," she said softly. "You're safe here." Her voice was the problem. It made him want to tell her everything. "I'm not who you think I am," he whispered. She blinked, confusion flickering warm in her eyes. "Who do you think I think you are?" He let out a shaky breath. "Just a man who needed help. A man who had nowhere to go." "Is that not true?" she asked, her tone gentle but searching. "It is," he said, "but it's not the whole truth." The air shifted between them, still calm, but tense with anticipation. She turned on the bench to face him fully, her knee brushing his. The touch was small, accidental, yet it tethered him to the moment. "What are you afraid of?" she asked softly. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "That you'll look at me differently. That you'll pull away. That his voice cracked slightly. "This feeling, whatever it is between us, will disappear." She exhaled a quiet breath, one so warm he felt it on his cheek. "You don't have to be afraid of me." He swallowed hard. "I didn't come to your door because I was homeless. I came because I needed escape from a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. I've spent years surrounded by people who wanted things from me, who saw my name before they saw me." Her lips parted slightly, not in shock. She wasn't the type to judge so quickly, but in realization. She saw the weight he'd been carrying, the loneliness beneath it. "And who are you, really?" she whispered. He finally met her eyes. "Someone with more money than I know what to do with. Someone people chase because of it. Someone who's never sure if he's being loved or used." Silence. But not cold, not distant. Her hand slid from his sleeve to his wrist, slow, intentional, her fingers curling gently around it. The warmth of her skin seemed to melt the fear inside him. "I didn't open my door because of who you were," she said. "And I'm not sitting here with you because of what you have." Her thumb brushed the inside of his wrist, soft, comforting, real. "I'm here because of how you make me feel. And nothing you said changes that." His breath trembled. For the first time, the truth didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a beginning. The final part of the story unfolds with a slow, emotional stillness, like the world has paused just to let these two breathe. After everything they've been through, after all the misunderstandings, pain, longing, and unspoken feelings, This moment is where everything finally aligns. The scene begins with the narrator standing outside her house late at night. The street is quiet except for the soft hum of distant traffic and a cold wind brushing his face. He isn't sure if she'll even open the door for him. He isn't sure if he deserves for her to open it. But he knocks anyway, 3 soft taps that carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. When she opens the door, she looks tired, hurt, but also hopeful. Her eyes search his face like she's trying to read everything he never said. The warm light behind her frames her silhouette, but all he can focus on is her trembling breath. She crosses her arms, not out of anger, but to hold herself together. He asks if he can come in, and she hesitates, then steps aside. The door clicks shut behind them like a seal on fate. Inside, the room is dimly lit. Soft yellow light casts long shadows across the walls. She doesn't sit. She waits. She wants to hear what he came to say, but she also fears it, because the truth could either heal her completely or break her all over again. He takes a deep breath. His hands shake. He looks at her like she is the only person left in the world who can save him. Then he begins speaking, not with the smooth confidence he uses around others, but with the raw, trembling honesty of a man finally admitting his truth. He tells her that the touch earlier, the way she held his hand, wasn't just a moment for him. It was a promise he felt deep in his bones. A promise he has wanted for years, but was too afraid to reach for. He confesses that he never stopped caring about her, not even for a second. He admits that every time she chose someone else, he told himself he could live with it, but he couldn't. He tells her that losing her wasn't something he could move on from. It was something that changed him. It made him realize that some people aren't meant to be chapters. Some are meant to be the whole book. She listens, tears forming slowly, not because she's weak, but because she's finally hearing the words she waited forever to hear. She tells him she didn't hold his hand for comfort. She held it because she was terrified of losing him too. Because even when she tried to love others, her heart always ran back to him. He steps closer, gently brushing away her tears with his thumb. There is no rush. No desesperación. Only a calm certainty. He takes her hand, this time firmly, deliberately, like sealing the promise she once made with her fingers. And he whispers, voice steady and full of conviction, "If you still want me, I'm ready to stop being afraid. I'm ready to choose you." Every time, she doesn't answer with words. She squeezes his hand, soft at first, then tighter, firmer, like a vow neither of them will ever break again. The story ends not in a kiss, but in a promise. A promise they will finally keep.